how did humans invent writing by accident? You're about to discover one of humanity's greatest inventions. But here's the thing. Nobody planned it. Nobody sat down and thought, let me create writing. It happened completely by accident, and the story of how we stumbled into one of history's most transformative technologies is far stranger than you probably think. The journey starts not with words, but with dirt, specifically with clay tokens. Around 11,000 years ago, in a region we now call the Fertile Crescent, something peculiar was happening. People weren't writing yet. They had no alphabet. They had no symbols that meant anything. But they were making tiny baked pieces of clay, and these tokens were tiny, some smaller than your pinky fingernail. Some were sphere-shaped, some were cone-shaped, some looked like little pyramids or discs. Here's what's important. Each shape meant something different. A small cone meant a measure of grain, a sphere meant a larger measure of grain, a disc meant oil, a cone meant something else entirely. These weren't words, these weren't letters, these were literally just objects that represented things. But they were the beginning of something revolutionary. Now, you might be wondering, why would anyone do this? Why make tokens instead of just using the actual grain? The answer reveals something fundamental about how humans think. As societies grew larger and communities started trading with each other, memory alone wasn't enough anymore. You couldn't remember every transaction. You couldn't track who owed you what. You couldn't keep records. So people invented tokens as a physical memory device. One trader might give another trader a bundle of tokens that meant, you owe me 3 measures of grain and 2 of oil. The tokens were a contract. They were proof. But then something interesting happened. People realized there was a problem. You have tokens representing goods. But what if someone loses a token? What if someone claims they gave you tokens you never received? There's no way to prove what the original deal was. There's no record of the agreement itself. So someone had a brilliant idea. Why not put the tokens inside a clay envelope? You make a hollow clay ball, put the tokens inside, and seal it up. Now you have a permanent record of the transaction that can't be changed or disputed. Problem solved. Except, not really. Now there's a new problem. You have a sealed clay envelope. You can't see what tokens are inside, so you need to count them first, and then there's no way to verify the contents without breaking the envelope open. Defeats the purpose entirely. And this is where the accident happens. Someone had the idea to mark the outside of the envelope. Before sealing it, press the tokens into the soft clay. This way, you could see what was inside without opening it. A cone pressed into the clay meant a cone token was inside. A sphere meant a sphere was inside. Now the marks on the envelope matched the tokens trapped within. But then something remarkable occurred to people. If the pressed marks on the outside can represent the tokens on the inside, do you actually need the tokens at all? Why put tokens in an envelope when you could just mark the clay directly? And that's when writing was accidentally invented. The marks that used to represent physical tokens became symbols. A pressed cone shape no longer meant there's a cone token inside. It meant 1 measure of grain. A pressed sphere no longer was proof of a physical sphere. It became a symbol for a larger measure. The physical objects and the symbols became separated. The symbols existed on their own. They had meaning independent of any actual token. This happened around 3200 BCE. In a place called Uruk, in ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have found the exact moment this transition occurred. You can see the evolution in the clay tablets themselves. Early tablets have deep, circular depressions made by pressing tokens into wet clay. These are pictographic. The symbols look like the things they represent, but gradually the symbols become more abstract. They stop looking like what they mean, they become arbitrary marks, and suddenly you have a writing system. But here's what makes this truly accidental. Nobody was trying to create a universal language. Nobody was sitting around saying, let's invent writing so we can write poetry and philosophy. They were just trying to solve a practical problem about grain and oil. The Sumerians, who developed this system further, realized something else. If pressed marks could represent measures of grain, couldn't they also represent other things? Couldn't they represent animals, property? Soon they started adding more symbols. They created symbols for cows, for sheep, for days, for weeks. The system expanded rapidly, but writing a clay tablet with a stylus is slow and tedious. Imagine pressing each symbol repeatedly. Your hand gets tired, the clay gets stiff. Someone realized that if you had a wedge-shaped stylus instead of a round one, you could press faster. You could make multiple quick marks instead of one careful impression. And this stylus technique created something called cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks that were faster to make and became the dominant writing system for thousands of years across the entire Middle East. Now here's something crucial about this accidental invention. It changed humanity forever. But the change didn't happen overnight. For centuries, writing remained purely functional. It was used for record keeping, inventory lists, tax records, contracts, that's it. Regular people didn't use writing. Most people couldn't read or write. It was a tool for administrators and scribes, not for everyday communication. Writing didn't become truly transformative until people realized it could do something else entirely. It could preserve thoughts. It could record stories. It could keep memories alive beyond a single person's lifetime. Historians debate when this shift happened, but by around 2600 BCE, people were using writing for something revolutionary: literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh was one of the earliest written stories we know of. It's essentially a poem, an epic tale written down to be preserved and shared. This wasn't practical record-keeping. This was something different. This was using writing to capture human creativity and experience. And that's when writing became powerful in an entirely new way. But the accidental invention continued. Different cultures would independently develop their own writing systems, but they all started from the same place. They all began with a practical problem needing a solution. The Egyptians developed hieroglyphics around the same time the Sumerians were using cuneiform. Not because they copied the idea, they were completely isolated from each other, but because they faced the same challenge. They needed to keep records. They needed a way to preserve information. The Egyptians started with something similar to tokens. They made ink marks on papyrus to represent commodities. But their system evolved differently. Instead of creating abstract wedge marks, they developed symbols that looked like actual objects. A symbol for a boat looked like a boat. A symbol for a person looked like a person. These hieroglyphics maintained a visual connection to what they represented. What's fascinating is that despite the visual difference, the underlying principle was identical: arbitrary marks on a surface representing real things in the world. China developed writing around the same time period, and their origin story is slightly different, though still rooted in practical necessity. Early Chinese writing used oracle bones. Shamans would write questions on bones, questions about harvests, about the weather, about the future. Then they'd heat the bones and interpret the cracks as answers. Eventually, they started writing the answers next to the questions. They started keeping records, and from this practice of divination and record-keeping, Chinese characters emerged. The Chinese system maintained an even stronger visual connection to the things it represented. Each character often contained radical elements, visual components, that hinted at the character's meaning. A character might contain a water radical if it relates to water, a wood radical if it relates to plants or trees. This made the system more transparent in some ways, but also more complex, since each character was unique rather than combinations of an alphabet. Now, here's something that often surprises people. Alphabets are actually a much later invention. The Sumerians and Egyptians and Chinese all developed writing systems, but none of them developed alphabets. Their systems worked differently. The Sumerian cuneiform could theoretically be adapted into an alphabet, but they never made that leap. The Egyptian hieroglyphic system could have evolved into letters representing sounds, but it didn't. An alphabet required a different kind of thinking. It required understanding that human speech could be broken down into individual sounds, and that each sound could be represented by a single mark. This is actually a fairly abstract concept. It requires thinking about language in a very specific way, not as pictures or symbols representing whole things or concepts, but as a collection of basic sounds that could be combined infinitely. The first true alphabet appeared around 1600 BCE, developed by Semitic peoples in the Middle East. It was probably a simplification of the Egyptian hieroglyphic system, created by workers who didn't need all of Egypt's complex symbols. They just wanted to record basic information quickly. So they borrowed some Egyptian symbols, simplified them, and used them to represent just the sounds of their language. This was revolutionary. With an alphabet, you could theoretically write any word. You weren't limited by the number of symbols you could memorize. You just needed to remember 26 letters or so, and you could construct any word in your language. But again, here's the accident. The people who created the alphabet probably weren't thinking, let's create a system that will eventually let people write anything. They were probably thinking, this system is faster and simpler for what we need to do. What makes all of this even more remarkable is that writing was invented independently multiple times. Not every culture learned to write from seeing another culture do it. The Mayans developed their own writing system completely independently. The Indus Valley Civilization had their own system. Easter Island had Rongo. These weren't copies or imitations. These were separate discoveries of the same human capability. This tells us something important about how human minds work. The ability to recognize that you can use marks to represent things and ideas isn't unique to one culture or time period. It's something that emerges naturally when a society reaches a certain level of complexity and encounters the same practical problems. How do we remember this? How do we prove we agreed to this? How do we keep this information safe? Now, you might think that once writing was invented, it immediately became widespread. Everyone learned to use it. Everyone benefited from it. But that's not what happened at all. For thousands of years after writing was invented, it remained a specialized skill. In ancient Egypt, only scribes knew how to write. In ancient Rome, most people couldn't read or write. In medieval Europe, literacy was basically confined to clergy and nobility. Writing was powerful, but it was also exclusive. And here's something important. Literate people often wanted to keep writing exclusive. In ancient Rome, there were people who feared that if too many people learned to read, it would democratize knowledge, and that would be dangerous. In medieval times, the church controlled literacy because controlling who could read meant controlling the spread of ideas. It took centuries, actually more like millennia, for literacy to become widespread. The printing press helped, democracy helped, public education systems helped. But even now, literacy isn't universal. There are still people in the world who can't read or write, and this reveals something profound. Writing is still, in some ways, an accident we haven't fully shared with humanity. The accidental invention of writing also had consequences nobody predicted. Once people could write, they could preserve ideas. They could pass knowledge across generations without losing it in transmission. An elder could write down knowledge instead of just hoping the young people would remember their stories. A mathematician could write down a discovery instead of having to teach it directly to every student. A philosopher could write down thoughts and have them read centuries after they died. This created a kind of intellectual leverage. Instead of each generation starting from scratch, they could build on what previous generations had written. This is arguably why civilization accelerated so dramatically after writing was invented. Not because humans suddenly became smarter, but because they could stand on the shoulders of those who came before them. They could access ancient knowledge. They could learn from the mistakes of people who had been dead for 1,000 years. Writing also created the possibility of law. Legal codes could be written down, and everyone could theoretically have access to the same rules. Before writing, laws were oral. They could change depending on who was telling them. Once they were written down, they became more fixed, more objective, harder to manipulate. But writing also created new kinds of problems. For instance, once writing existed, misinformation could be preserved. A false idea once written down could spread and persist. A lie could outlive the person who told it. Propaganda could be manufactured and distributed. Writing didn't just preserve truth, it could preserve untruth just as effectively. This is something we still grapple with today. We think of written words as more authoritative than spoken words. We say, "I saw it written down," as though that's proof. But writing doesn't guarantee accuracy, it just makes something permanent. The accidental invention of writing also led to the emergence of literature and art forms that wouldn't have been possible before. Poetry, for instance. Oral poetry exists in every culture, but written poetry is different. It can play with visual appearance on the page. It can use rhyme schemes and meters that are designed to be read, not heard. The same is true of novels and essays and all the forms of written expression that followed. What's remarkable is that these art forms emerged because the technology existed, not because anyone had specifically planned for them. Nobody invented writing so that someday there could be novels. Novels emerged as a byproduct of the existence of writing. This pattern repeats throughout history. Technologies are invented for one purpose, and then people discover they can be used for entirely different purposes. Writing was invented for record-keeping, and became the vehicle for human creativity and philosophy. The printing press was invented to make books cheaper and more available, and it sparked the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The internet was invented for military and academic communication, and it became the platform for nearly all modern human interaction. The accidental nature of these inventions is important. It teaches us that we often don't know the true consequences of what we're creating. When the Sumerians first pressed tokens into clay, they had no idea they were inventing something that would eventually enable all of human civilization as we know it. They just needed a better way to keep track of grain. This has implications for how we think about innovation today. Sometimes the most powerful inventions come from people trying to solve immediate practical problems, not from grand visions or long-term planning. A person tries to remember something better, invents a solution, and that solution cascades into something that changes the entire world. Let me tell you about something else that's remarkable about the invention of writing. It created the concept of the author. Before writing, knowledge belonged to the community. A story was told, retold, and changed each time. But once stories were written down, they had a fixed form. And once they had a fixed form, the idea that a specific person created that form became important. This is why we know the name Homer, the supposed author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Not because Homer definitely existed or definitely wrote those epics, but because once written literature existed, the idea of authorship became meaningful. You could point to a text and say, "This person created this." Before writing, this concept barely existed. There were storytellers and musicians, certainly, but the idea of individual authorship wasn't central. Once writing came along, it became fundamental to how we understand culture and creativity. Here's another accident within the accident. Writing led to the standardization of language. In oral cultures, language is fluid. It changes from region to region, from generation to generation. But once you start writing things down, you need consistency. You need everyone to agree on spelling and grammar. Otherwise, texts become hard to read. So writing actually locked languages into place. It created standards. It made regional variations more noticeable and more marked. This had real social consequences. People with correct spelling and grammar could be distinguished from those without. Educational hierarchies emerged based on literacy. And this is true today. We still use written standards of language to judge people's intelligence and education. Someone might speak perfectly intelligibly but be judged harshly for their writing. This is actually a consequence of the invention of writing. The idea that written language is more correct than spoken language. The invention of writing also made history possible. Before writing, there was no history, really. There were stories about the past, but they were subject to all the distortions of oral tradition. Once writing existed, you could keep records. You could preserve specific dates and events. You could create a sequential record of what happened. This is why we call the invention of writing the boundary between prehistory and history. But this also means that our understanding of the past is filtered through writing. We know about cultures that wrote things down. We know very little about cultures that didn't develop writing. Entire civilizations and peoples basically disappear from our historical record simply because they didn't have writing. This is a profound bias in how we understand human history. The invention of writing was also an invention of forgetting in a way. Oral cultures have incredible memory. People in non-literate societies often can memorize vast amounts of information. They have to, because it's not written down. But once writing exists, there's less pressure to memorize. Why memorize something you can look up? So literacy can actually reduce certain kinds of memory capacity while expanding our ability to store and access information. Now, let's talk about the most recent chapter of this accidental invention, digital writing. Because writing is still being invented and reinvented. When computers first appeared, people thought they would reduce the need for writing. Everything would be digital. Everything would be automated. But instead, writing exploded. Emails, texts, social media posts, instant messages. Humans are writing more than ever before in history. We're just writing in different ways. And this digital writing is changing language again. We're developing new conventions for how to communicate in text. Emoticons are an attempt to capture tone and expression in written form. All caps means you're shouting. 3 dots mean you're uncertain or trailing off. These are new conventions emerging spontaneously, the way written language has always evolved. What's fascinating is that digital writing is partially returning to the characteristics of oral language. Texts are short and immediate, they're conversational, you respond quickly. It's more like having a written conversation than writing a formal letter. The technology is changing how we use writing. We're even seeing writing change in ways that would have been unimaginable a few decades ago. We write in fragments. We write in emoji. We write in memes, images with text overlaid that communicate complex ideas through a combination of visual and textual elements. Writing is expanding beyond the alphabet. And if this continues, if technology continues to evolve, we might see new forms of writing emerge that we can't currently imagine. Virtual reality might create new ways to record and experience written communication. Neural interfaces might allow us to record and share thoughts in ways that bypass language entirely. The point is, the invention of writing wasn't a single moment. It's an ongoing process. It started with tokens and clay tablets, evolved through countless iterations and cultural variations, and continues to evolve today. What the story of writing teaches us is that the most profound changes in human capability don't always come from deliberate planning. They come from people trying to solve immediate problems. Someone wanted a better way to remember something. That led to tokens. Someone wanted to prove what the tokens represented. That led to pressing marks into clay. Someone realized the marks could represent things without the tokens. And suddenly, writing existed. The history of writing is the history of humanity accidentally building the foundations of civilization. And if that's true for writing, it's probably true for a lot of things we think we deliberately created. Maybe language itself was an accident, maybe culture was an accident, maybe even consciousness is an accident, the byproduct of brains that evolved for other reasons but happened to be complex enough to develop self-awareness. The invention of writing reminds us that we're not as in control of our own development as we like to think. We're constantly stumbling into the future, solving problems as they arise, and creating consequences we never anticipated. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Some of our best creations have come from accidents. Every time you pick up a pen and write something down, every time you read a book, every time you send a text message, you're participating in this ancient accident that started with clay tokens 11,000 years ago. You're using a technology that nobody planned to create, that emerged from simple practical necessity, and that changed everything about what it means to be human. And that's the remarkable truth about writing. We didn't invent it on purpose. We stumbled into one of our greatest achievements without even knowing what we were doing.